First off, I think that many of you might think that the world is falling apart. That's what media has us thinking about, I think. And it's not just the media, of course, but then are we really, and how do we know? So here's a take from a different point of view from Steven Pinker. Here he compares us with the 18th century and says that, the evidence is actually overwhelming that life in general has gotten better. Humans are living an additional 40 years. Our lives are also healthier and wealthier. Extreme poverty levels are at historic lows. More people live in freer societies that engage in fewer and less bloody wars. We have less murderous neighborhoods, drive safer cars, mix more freely between races, and discriminate less against women and homosexuals. This is more than 600 pages, 75 figures. It's really a lot to take in. And it's not still clear whether or not life has improved. So my question to you is, what do you think? Are we in fact better off? And how do we know? So that's going to be the first step of this presentation. So how to measure societal progress. So I start off with the UN as being the authoritative view. And part of that is because the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which were mentioned before, you're all familiar with. What you may not know is that they were developed based on 2 years of intensive public consultation with civil society and other stakeholders around the world. So I'm thinking of this as being the most democratic representation of the goals in which we should be moving towards. But there are some limitations with this Sustainable Development Goals. They're supposed to be measured using 232 indicators. This is too many to report and process. Many countries are not preparing all of these indicators, and it's difficult for individuals, media to take all this information in. So I think that we should instead have one headline measure. So this is going to be a little bit different than the dashboard that has been suggested by the OECD, but there's more to say here. So first off, my reasoning for one measure. The limitations are that multiple dimensions may move in conflicting directions. For example, basic consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. And it's unclear what we do in this case. Does that represent progress or not? Also, officials may strategically choose which measures to report and emphasize in their reporting to the public. So for these reasons, it's difficult. And of course, we do need a measure. So this is how Carrie started off at the beginning. We need to have some way of looking at progress to understand how we're doing. And here's an old quote: if you cannot measure it, you cannot improve it. So we need to have a measure. And of course, I'm not the first person to say this, though. So this is really contradictory to what was said before. We need a measure of the same level of vulgarity as GNP, just one measure, but a measure that is not as blind as the social aspects of human lives as GDP. So this is from the originator of the Human Development Report. And, for these reasons, I think that we need to have, one measure. However, I want to emphasize, this is the headline measure. This is what we report. This is what we focus on. This is not how policy is being made. So think of the example from Italy, where in Italy, they have 2 different sets of measures. So the finance department, this is what Carrie was saying before, has a short list of indicators, but then the stats department has a list that's actually expanding over time. I think it's more than 160 measures now. So we need to have a broad set of measures for policymaking. And at the same time, maybe just one measure, I would argue, to provide to the public for understanding whether or not the world in which you live is improving or not. So what might that measure look like? From the United Nations, you can actually think back to earlier work from the 1990s, the Human Development Report, where they state, we are rediscovering the essential truth that people must be at the center of all development. I'm taking development here as a synonym for progress. The purpose of development is to offer people more options. One of their options is access to income, not as an end in itself, but as a means to acquiring human well-being. So they're stating explicitly here that well-being is the end all, right? Income is a means, it's an input to well-being. So not just the UN, of course, supports well-being. In the 2009 report that was talked about by Carrie, the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy commissioned 25 social scientists, of whom 6 are Nobel Prize winners, and to assess the measurement of economic performance and social progress. They recommended shifting emphasis from measuring economic production to measuring people's well-being, among other recommendations. And to measure progress, then we can measure well-being. In the Sarkozy Commission, among others, recommended using both objective and subjective indicators. This is more consistent with what was reported discussed before. And then here's another one that's not a lot of people maybe know about. In this Diener, actually, it's a very short publication. There are 48 signatories to this. So a substantial amount of support for using subjective well-being, among others. Oops. Yeah. So among the subjective well-being indicators, life evaluations are the preferred measure, I think, among economists. And then also in the well-being frameworks that were described before, the life evaluations are the most commonly used. So life evaluations seem to be the way to go here. And life evaluations, I'm thinking mostly of life satisfaction. There are, of course, limitations with these. They're both objective and subjective measures. I'm not going to discuss them in much detail here. I report on them in a paper, it's a working paper, and it's going to go into the encyclopedia that Roger is editing. Also, of course, today's third session is going to talk about limitations and some of the strengths of subjective well-being measures more generally. So, but I do want to say that with subjective well-being measures, especially life evaluations, when we evaluate and report our satisfaction with life, people implicitly decide for themselves what is important to them, the degree of importance, and then provide a summary measure. So for me, this represents the best single indicator of how an individual is doing, and then aggregated how a country is doing. So life evaluations are democratic, non-paternalistic, and holistic. So then, if we take life evaluations as the measure of progress, how do we not achieve progress? So I think you're all going to be familiar with the Easterlin Paradox, mostly all of you. And I just want to bring to bear the most recent evidence and also clarify the definition. So it's the contradiction between two empirical relationships. It's not just one aspect of it. So of the two relationships, one is controversial. So this is the one that is talked about the most. So over time, countries with greater GDP per capita growth do not experience greater increases in happiness. Right? So I think this is something that many of you are familiar with, but to illustrate this a little bit more clearly, quickly, I want to start off with how some of the data are, where we start with the data. So here's an example of France. So we have 6 life satisfaction points over the long time horizon from the early 1980s into the late 2010s. So you have time across the bottom, life satisfaction on the left. And then what we do is we fit a trend line to us to get at the average change in life satisfaction by year. Here's another example in the UK. So you have a flatter line and therefore a smaller change in life satisfaction per year. And so this is going to be done for our full set of countries, just to illustrate. And in this case, you can see that although Great Britain had a faster GDP per capita growth, they did not have a larger gain in life satisfaction over this time. So this illustrates for 2 countries. Here it is for our full set of countries. So you can see a fairly dispersed set of results here, or the scatter plot. So you have the annual change in life satisfaction on the left for each of those countries, and GDP per capita growth across the bottom. You have Azerbaijan, Iraq, out here on the far right, but then Nigeria, India, Thailand. So you can see, some of these countries, Thailand's had really fast growth, but actually a negative change in life satisfaction over this period of time. So it's not clear, from this initial set of results, if there's an impact. And then when you look at the trends in each of the set of countries, you see that actually they're negative, with the exception of the developed countries. So even in the less developed countries, a greater growth in GDP per capita does not translate into a greater improvement in life satisfaction. So a lot of people get this wrong, that there's this threshold that GDP per capita has an improvement on life satisfaction up until a point. Even in the less developed countries, when we look at changes in happiness over time, it's not related to changes in growth. And then there's two different sets of countries here. Well, four ultimately. The TCs, ETCs represent transition countries from communism to capitalism, and they are based on really just what the availability of time. There's more details in the paper, of course. So here's the most recent data using Gallup. So we have in this set, many more countries. We have 123. So a lot of those are less developed countries. And again, here's this dashed line in orange. There you have actually the flattest slope. So the least increase in well-being associated with growth. The largest one here is the green one for the transition countries. But the transition countries are countries that were changing in a lot of ways, right? They're not just changing based on growth. There was a change in the both the economic and political structure in those countries. And even here, so it would take, it's the only statistically significant relationship that we find across all of our specifications. So looking at these different country groups in the two different data sets. Even here, if you increased growth by 1 percentage point, it would take 100 years for life satisfaction to increase by 1 point. So my argument is that that's too small to be relied upon as an important measure of or important target, I would say. The other thing to mention, the time duration matters. So 2005 to 2019, the previous one was over the long run. So the goal here, I think, when we think about progress, is not to have an impact from 1 year to the next. It's to have an impact that is lasting over a long period of time, of course. So greater GDP per capita growth rates are not meaningfully associated with greater changes in life satisfaction in the long run within any of the country groups, including the less developed ones. And there's additional explanation, for why this might occur in a recent publication. So then how do we lastingly improve life satisfaction? So welfare state policies, according to Easterlin. Thanks. Full employment and safety net policies do increase evaluative happiness. And let me give you some more recent data. So here are 3 studies that I participated in. First, in this one on the left, you have the in general, across all of them, you have life satisfaction on the left. And in this case, you have social spending across the bottom. So this is, expenditures on things related to health, pension, education, that type of thing. And you can see that although this looks fairly flat, this is a meaningful magnitude. So countries that spend more on the social programs are happier. There's a large set of 104 countries here. Here in the middle, this is related to the Great Recession or the financial crisis of 2008. And you can see that countries that had greater unemployment assistance, or if you became unemployed, the amount of income you would receive. So you have, Denmark up here, Finland, Sweden, they had a smaller decline in happiness over this period of time. So there was a decline, of course, during the Great Recession, but it was moderated by the social policies, in this case, the labor market policies, unemployment support. On the right, we have Japan over time. So it's hard to see this. This is going from 1980 to 2010. And the dashed line is life satisfaction. So you'll remember that Japan had the lost decade from 1990 to 2000, maybe lost decades now, where growth was minimal. And that's actually exactly where we see life satisfaction increasing. In this period here, from 1980 to 1990, you had growth going at a fairly high rate, and yet life satisfaction is actually decreasing. This line, on the other hand, seems to correspond quite nicely, and that is the generosity of the welfare state. This paper is actually, these are micro papers, so I'm just giving you kind of the, key takeaway. So there's, more to it than this. But ultimately, what you see is that the generosity of the welfare state is positively related to life satisfaction, both across countries and over time. And in the case of Japan, over the long period. of 30 years. So another study, more recently, we just finished this. You can see on this figure to the right, changes in life satisfaction from 1981-82 to 2017 approximately in 10 European countries. Sorry, you can't see this on the bottom. I think it was, if I remember right, this is actually Finland. Finland's here, Sweden. I think it's Sweden. So you have in Spain, Italy, you have substantial increases in life satisfaction over the long run. This is just a simple change. It's a very simple analysis. And then on the far right, you have countries that have had a decline over this long period. So the question is, what explains these long run trends? So there's substantial differences. And we tested 5 different variables to try to explain this. GDP per capita, air pollution, and that's the PM2.5, the particulate matter, social capital or social trust, unemployment, and the generosity of the welfare state. Thank you. So the generosity is the only variable for which we find a significant relationship across these with the trend in happiness. And I think I can click. Can you click on the details for me? I'll just give you the data, the information real quick. Thanks. So just to show you how this was conducted. So you have a time series analysis and a fixed effect regression. And across the bottom, you can see there's only 10 countries. But in the fixed effect analysis, we have 49 observations. So they just give you a sense. And then the various control variables. So the generosity is across the top. Oops, sorry about that. You can see here that the only variable that loads statistically significantly is the generosity of the welfare state. All of these other variables, no statistically significant relationship, and it holds in the fixed effect analysis here. So you could think that any one of these variables would explain the change in life satisfaction over time, and the only one that does, the traditional economic view is that it should be GDP. Here, it's the generosity of the welfare state. So, can you click at the top arrow for me, the top right, please? Thank you. Okay. So concluding, societal progress is marked by increasing well-being, which can be measured using life satisfaction or life evaluations. This is consistent with UN views as more tractable than the SDGs. However, just as a caveat, we can't use any single item measure to choose or set policy targets, choose among policies or to set them. But I do believe that we can use life satisfaction as a headline measure, especially when we are competing against another single item measure, which is GDP. So GDP alone does not contribute meaningfully, if at all, to life satisfaction in the long run. And this is now based on more than 120 countries. So when does life satisfaction increase? Generosity of the welfare state programs better explain life satisfaction trends, GDP per capita, air pollution, social capital, unemployment over the nearly 40 years in 10 European countries. So increasing generosity is associated with lasting increases in life satisfaction and or progress. Okay, thank you.
Okay, in a recent paper that we submitted to a journal with Francesco and Giulia, we were claiming that public policies can do the most to increase happiness. And the observation of one referee was, yes, but they are financed through GDP. So greater GDP may have an indirect effect on improving happiness. How would you answer to this objection? And then I have another question. Pensions, healthcare, education, unemployment benefits, are you able to disentangle which one has a greater effect on happiness?
I just a comment really. So I have to push back on this claim that life satisfaction scales are democratic and non-paternalistic, because in practice, I just really don't think this is true. So what we actually do with life satisfaction data is we put it on the left-hand side of a regression, and then we, the analysts, decide what is on the right-hand side of the regression. And from that, we determine what policies would be optimal. This seems not very democratic to me. And then whenever you say, maybe we should just ask people what determines their life satisfaction, immediately you get this response that no, people are riddled with cognitive biases, and so we can't trust their responses, which seems to me like a very paternalistic kind of claim. So I think relative to GDP, certainly I agree with you. And from the mission statement that you have of one indicator, I think this is fine. But I think we as a community probably need to think a bit more self-critically about how democratic and non-paternalist this is.
Yeah, so financed by GDP. So you can see that even in the less developed countries, right? So where they have far less money available to them, the generosity of the welfare state is positively associated with life satisfaction. And this is at a point in time and over time. So yes, it's true that it's financed this way, but they could be spending this money. Take Costa Rica as an example. Compare that with Germany. So Costa Rica has a high expenditure, or compare that with the United States. They spend much more on social programs than the US does and have a fourth of the GDP. So it should be possible even with low levels of GDP. The various different components, we have looked at that, but only, let's say, cursorily. So just a very early stage initial relationship. So I don't have an answer for you. Worth looking at. Mark, so democratic non-paternalistic. So the right-hand side, sometimes we use machine learning techniques. So it's not strictly the case. We'll throw the whole kitchen sink at trying to explain life satisfaction. And you have people doing it from also multiple disciplines. And you have people who, in the case of, say, the Better Life Index, who are able to contribute, saying, what's important to them. In that case, the Better Life Index is really just with weights. So I do believe, and then you have the public consultation that is going into determining what dimension should be important. So that's in the case of the SDGs, that was obvious. I mentioned it here, but in many other instances, we also have that. There are the SLICA, the Survey for Living and Income Standards in the Arctic nations. That survey was co-developed with the local people, and they did put different variables into the survey. So partially for this reason. So I do think that it is still much better, as you agree with me, than alternative measures. But there are at least many instances where I would argue it's still non-paternalistic. And cannot trust the biases. Also, I disagree with that to some extent. There are biases there, certainly, but it's also, highly validated with biometrics, brain scans, and it proves to be important in things that we think it should be related to and predictive of outcomes that are also consistent with theory. So there's still quite meaningful data that suggests that, well, yes, there may be biases, but we're, providing something of value here.